From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
For them to introduce 25 bills on one day in a special session and not inform anyone on the other side of the aisle or the citizens is nothing but tyranny. And North Carolina needs to take heed. The citizens need to reject this, and the entire world and this nation needs to reject what's going on here.
A legislative coup? Republican lawmakers in North Carolina are attempting to strip power from the state's incoming governor, Democrat Roy Cooper. This week, Republicans introduced dozens of new bills to rewrite the state's balance of power. We'll speak to the Reverend William Barber, president of Repairers of the Breach and head of the North Carolina NAACP. Then to Donald Trump and his generals.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump lambasted the performance of U.S. military generals. Now he's surrounding himself with generals in many top posts. We'll speak with military historian Andrew Bacevich to talk about the generals and Trump's overall foreign policy.
He knows as much about national security policy as I know about running a business. And what I know about running a business is next to nothing.
Then to Pirates of the Caribbean. We'll look at how Santander's revolving door with Puerto Rico's development bank exacerbated a fiscal catastrophe for the Puerto Rican people. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Syrian government says it's temporarily suspending the evacuation of civilians from eastern Aleppo after accusing the anti-government rebel fighters of breaking the terms of the ceasefire. One of the terms called for anti-government rebels to allow for the evacuation of wounded civilians in another part of Syria, two government-held towns in Idlib province, which have been besieged by rebels. About 8,000 people did successfully escape from eastern Aleppo Thursday before the evacuations were halted. There are also separate news reports of evacuation convoys being fired upon. On Thursday, dozens of United Nations workers staged a walkout in New York City to show solidarity with the Syrian people.
We stand united in solidarity with the people of Syria. We call upon the member states of the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, to take urgent, practical action to end the horror in Syria.
In the United States, President Obama has vowed to retaliate against Russia over Russia's alleged meddling in the U.S. presidential election to help Donald Trump win. This is President Obama speaking on NPR Thursday.
I think there is no doubt that when any foreign government tries to impact the integrity of our elections, that we need to take action, and we will, at a time and place of our own choosing. Some of it may be explicit and publicized. Some of it may not be. But Mr. Putin is well aware of my feelings about this because I spoke to him directly about it.
According to NBC, unnamed U.S. intelligence officials say Russian President Vladimir Putin was personally involved in the effort to meddle in the 2016 U.S. presidential election to help Donald Trump win. The CIA has accused Russia of intervening, and President Obama's ordered a review of Russia's role. President-elect Donald Trump has called the claims ridiculous. Donald Trump has tapped the far-right-wing bankruptcy lawyer David Friedman to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Many are calling Friedman an unprecedented pick for the position, given his hostility toward peace between Israelis and Palestinians and his disregard for international law. Friedman has no diplomatic experience. He supports Israel's Jewish-only settlements in the occupied West Bank and says he doesn't think it would be illegal for Israel to annex the entire Palestinian territory, despite the fact that it would be blatantly illegal under international law. On Thursday, Friedman also said he opposes a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine.
The Trump administration will never pressure Israel into a two-state solution or any other solution that is against the wishes of the Israeli people.
In response to the announcement, Jewish Voice for Peace said, quote, Friedman's appointment is a distressing signal that the new administration will give the Israeli government a free hand to deepen its fundamentally undemocratic and abusive control over Palestinian land, resources, and rights, unquote. Donald Trump's cabinet is the richest in history. The 17 people Trump has selected for either cabinet or cabinet-level positions so far have nearly $10 billion in combined wealth. That's more than the 43 million poorest Americans have combined, and Trump still has not filled some key positions. One of Trump's top advisors has suggested Trump may give his oldest daughter, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner, formal positions in the White House, claiming the Trump transition team believes they've found an exception to the United States anti-nepotism laws. Kellyanne Conway said, quote, the anti-nepotism law apparently has an exception if you want to work in the West Wing because the president is able to appoint his own staff, unquote. Trump's already sparked increasing concerns about conflicts of interest by including his adult children in key political meetings, including the vetting of potential cabinet members, given his children's role in the running of the Trump business empire. In New York City, dozens of Native Americans and allies held protests at 4 separate bank branches Thursday to demand Wells Fargo, Citibank, TD Bank divest from the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline. The actions were organized by a group of Native Americans who traveled from Standing Rock in North Dakota to New York City, bringing with them a sacred drum from Wounded Knee. The group blocked traffic during rush hour. This is Sage Poirier from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota.
Our plan here is to shut down Wells Fargo and Citibank. They are the biggest corporations that support Dakota Access Pipeline, and we're telling them no. It's a divest. Future, it's our future. Many told me water is sacred. This is life. Without it, nobody can survive. For our children.
The actions Thursday in New York City were part of a months-long campaign to target the major Wall Street banks funding the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is Standing Rock Sioux Nation member Chase Iron Eyes during one of the disruptions.
We were never the aggressors. All we wanted was peace and to raise our families and to know the power of peace. But we don't know peace because your money is funding genocide in North Dakota right now. So take a long, hard look, and you'll know why we're here and why we're never going away. How?
Meanwhile, in Iowa, residents rallied in support of farmers and landowners who are fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline Company's use of eminent domain to seize their land to build the pipeline. The 14 landowners argued in a state court Thursday that regulators should not have authorized the use of eminent domain in this case because the pipeline does not serve the public good. Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the pipeline, is trying to argue this point is moot, given that the pipeline has already been built despite residents' resistance. In Charleston, South Carolina, a jury has found Dylan Roof guilty on 33 counts of federal hate crimes for murdering 9 black worshipers, including Pastor Clementa Pinckney, at the historic Emmanuel AME Church in June 2015. The verdict, reached after the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, came after 30 witnesses testified over 6 days. One of the witnesses was Felicia Sanders, who said she watched as Roof pulled out a Glock 45 caliber handgun and began shooting, striking, and wounding her son and killing her aunt. She says she took cover underneath a table with her 11-year-old granddaughter and tried to cover herself and the girl in other people's blood so Roof would think they were already dead. Roof embraced white supremacist views and was shown in photographs posing with the Confederate flag and a pistol. Dylan Roof is facing the death penalty. His sentence will be decided in the penalty phase of the trial, slated to begin January 3rd. In New York City, a jury has convicted former Rikers correction officer Brian Cole of beating prisoner Ronald Spear to death in 2012. Officer Cole was accused of repeatedly kicking Spear in the head while 2 other officers held him down. During the trial, the prosecutors said not only did Officer Cole not regret killing Ronald Spear, but he was proud of it and displayed a framed article from the Village Voice about the killing in his bedroom. Officer Cole faces life in prison. And in Chile, Today is the launch of a new art exposition entitled 2054, which reveals testimonies of survivors of torture under the Pinochet dictatorship that the government had sought to keep secret for decades. The stories were collected as part of a commission launched in 2003 to document torture under the dictatorship of the U.S.-backed General Augusto Pinochet. In 2004, the Chilean government passed a law ordering the testimonies remain secret for 50 years, until 2054. But a project launched by Chilean artist Francisco Papas Fritas and torture survivors has now succeeded in declassifying these testimonies. This is torture survivor Scarlett Mathieu Logercio.
On London Street, I was held approximately 10 days. While I was there, I suffered all kinds of tortures, specifically sexual, political violence, psychologically torture threatening me with the detention of my children, and psychological torture forcing me to listen to how they tortured other people, which is something very difficult to endure. Psychologically, you're left traumatized, because when they torture you, in some way, you are all the time resisting. But when you listen to how they torture other people, and I have talked about this with several people, it is one of the most difficult things to endure.
On Thursday, Democracy Now! Spoke with artist Francisco Papas Fritas about the importance of declassifying these testimonies.
This is important for Chile because it opens up the real chance for Chile to take control and to demand truth about what happened under the dictatorship. This is something that neither the executive branch nor the legislature, nor even the judiciary, which has had its hands tied, have been able to do. This is what the families are asking for: justice and the reconstruction of memory. Above all, memory.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Republican lawmakers in North Carolina are being accused of waging a legislative coup by attempting to strip power from the state's incoming governor, Democrat Roy Cooper. Cooper narrowly beat Republican Governor Pat McCrory by 10,000 votes last month. In an unprecedented move, Republicans filed dozens of new bills this week during a special session of the General Assembly that was called to consider relief for Hurricane Matthew victims. The Republican lawmakers are attempting to impose measures to slash the number of state employees appointed by the governor, require Senate approval for all of the governor's cabinet picks, and strip the governor of the power to appoint University of North Carolina trustees. Another bill aims to weaken the governor's control over the state elections board. Yet another Republican bill would strip some power away from the Democratic governor and give it to the lieutenant governor, who happens to be a Republican. None of the bills were being considered until after Republican Governor Pat McCrory conceded defeat. Governor-elect Roy Cooper criticized the actions of the Republican lawmakers.
The Republican leadership in the General Assembly has put forth a number of proposed pieces of legislation over the last 12 to 24 hours. Most people might think that this is a partisan power grab, but it is really more ominous. It's really about hurting public education, working families, state employees, health care, and clean air and water.
At least 17 people were arrested at the state capitol Thursday protesting the Republican efforts. The NAACP of North Carolina has decried the legislative actions, describing it as a form of Jim Crow governance. Meanwhile, another effort by Republican lawmakers to pack the state Supreme Court, which just tilts Democratic, appears to have been defeated. Republicans were threatening to try to add 2 more justices to the court after the Democratic African-American judge Mike Morgan defeated a Republican incumbent in the November election, tilting the court 4-3 Democrat. The North Carolina Supreme Court has 7 judges for the last 80 years. Well, for more, we're going to Raleigh, North Carolina, to be joined by Reverend Dr. William Barber, president of Repairers of the Breach and president of the North Carolina NAACP. Reverend Barber, welcome back to Democracy Now! So it took the Republican governor, McCrory, about a month to concede defeat, right? He is the first... he's the only Republican incumbent governor who was defeated in this sweep through the country this year. And then explain what happened.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for having me on Democracy Now! And let me just say to all the listeners, particularly in North Carolina, all roads head to the General Assembly. We need you there today by 10 o'clock a.m. You know, we had this election, and what you have here are a group of extremists, Tea Party extremists, who are very afraid of the changing South and the changing demographics in North Carolina. You're exactly right. The governor refused to concede. And they're scared because we're the only state that held off the full weight of Trumpism in the South. We have a movement there, and that movement has been working for years, and particularly over the last 3 years with Moral Monday movements. We were able to change the consciousness of the state, and the governor lost the election. Now, this was after, Amy, the Republican-led State Board of Election put in place 158 less voting sites, early voting sites, than we had in 2014 and 12. They lost the worst voter suppression bill that they pushed in the courts. The court said it was surgical racism. They lost on redistricting. The courts have now demanded that we have to redraw lines and have a new election next year with the legislature. They lost the governor's race, the Secretary of State's race, the auditor's race, the Attorney General's race, and the Supreme Court became more progressive, with an African-American winning 76 of the 100 counties and winning by over 300,000 votes. It's a sign of things to come when we organize in the South. And so the governor and those extremists refused. They did everything they could. They even purged votes, Amy, during the election. They lost again, and we forced votes to be put back on the books. So they have seen that they have tried everything, but when there's a movement of the people, a moral movement of the people, we can in fact change the South. And if you do that, you change the nation. And so now, with these losses, they are now engaging in this extreme power grab and policy grab.
Well, Reverend Barber, you wrote recently in a column for Think Progress that you think that you're seeing the birth pangs of a third Reconstruction. What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, you know, the first Reconstruction in the 1800s, black and whites worked together after slavery, fundamentally changed the South. And then you had this massive reaction to turn back all of those policies, which actually came to the strongest point with the selection of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, who was a presidential candidate who lost the popular vote, but was selected through the electoral process with the promise that he would restore the white hierarchy, if you will, in the country by his appointments and by his changing the Supreme Court. Then the second Reconstruction was the Civil Rights Movement. You had all of the massive changes, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, the 1954 to 68. Then you have a reaction called the Southern Strategy, led by Ken Phillips and Richard Nixon, Law and Order. Richard Nixon claimed he would bring, Kevin Phillips, told him, if you find out who hates who and who fears who, we can pit people against one another in the South, and we can rule the South for 50 years. And you know, if you rule the South, if you can control the South, you control 171 electoral votes by just controlling the former 13 Confederate states. You control 26 senators in the United States Senate, which means you only need 25 from the other 37 states. You control 31% of the United States House of Representatives, which means you only need 20 from the other 37 states. And you control 13 governors and 13 general assemblies that control state boards of election. So if you break through that, then you have fundamentally changed politics. I believe all of the pushback we're seeing, the voter suppression, the redistricting, is because the extremists see the possibility of a third Reconstruction. They know that if we register 30% of the African-American voter, unregistered voters in the South, and then we add to that whites and progressive whites and Latinos, you will have changed the South. And if you ever change that math, and you ever have deep dive organizing that gets people to stop voting against their own interests, grown-up conversations about race and economics, and people begin to see themselves as allies, blacks and whites, and no longer fear one another, then you have a third Reconstruction. I think we're in the birth pains of it. North Carolina is one of the places that points to it. Virginia is one of the places that points to it. The closing gaps that we're seeing. When you look at Trump, he didn't win the South by the gaps that Ronald Reagan did. And if we have deep dive organizing in the South, we can push this third Reconstruction to full adulthood. I really believe that.
And Reverend Barber, you've also talked repeatedly about the difference between fusion politics and populism. Could you elaborate on that as well?
Well, you know, populism could be once was a lynch mob in the South. And, you know, Trump is engaged in a certain kind of nativism and populism. But fusion politics grows out of, it was named during the first Reconstruction, when black former slaves and white farmers, poor people, became allies in the South and saw their common interests. And so when you have fusion, when you hold race and economics together, I'm concerned, for instance, about the way some progressives are talking about this election. They keep talking about just an economic fix, or we just need to talk to white, working, poor people. But if you do not factor in race and how, as Neil Painter said at Princeton, you would not have a Trump without an Obama. That President Obama's election represented a kind of inversion of a hierarchy in this country. And so what we have to wrestle with is what caused, for instance, many whites to vote for a candidate that actually says, and there are 8 million more white people that are poor than black, but they vote for a candidate that's against living wages. What causes many whites to vote for a candidate that says, I'm going to cut your health care, when 80% of the people who will lose their health care are persons that do not have a college degree, and 56% of them are white? What trumps common sense? That's the grown-up race policy question. Now, if you can bridge that in a fusion, and if you can get black people and white people and Latinos to begin to see their issues together, if you can get people, for instance, the LGBT community, to understand the same people against the LGBT community are the same people that vote against public education. The same people that vote against public education normally vote against health care. Same people against health care vote against living wages. And you can go on and on. Same people against living wages are normally against voting rights. And in the states, if you can build from the bottom up indigenously led fusion coalition, you can have the kind of transformation we're beginning to see in North Carolina in the South.
I want to go back. I want to go back to what's being called a legislative coup in North Carolina. This is Dallas Woodhouse, the executive director of the state Republican Party, speaking to reporters Thursday.
People ask the question, do two wrongs make a right? I think it is the inevitable outcome of divided government. And the checks and balances that come with it, and the checks and balances that people voted for. Roy Cooper's still going to be the governor. He still gets the keys to the mansion at some point on January 1st. He still gets to use the big ballroom, and when Republican bills come to him, he can sign them. He can choose not to sign or let them come into law. Or in most cases, he can sit there and be overridden. That's the system we have.
Didn't voters pick Roy Cooper with the assumption that these were the powers that the governor had when Election Day occurred, and they've seen what Pat McCrory has done with those powers and whether or not to give him another 4 years with those responsibilities?
I don't know that I can answer that.
Yeah.
I mean, the voters can at times be contradictory, but they did. You know, Cooper won one election. We won 109 in the General Assembly, and a whole bunch of statewide council state seats that we hadn't had before.
So that is Dallas Woodhouse, executive director of the state Republican Party. If you could respond, Reverend Barber, to what he says, and also go through the bills. I mean, it is just astounding what's happening. Is it something like
22?
And talk about the powers that they are trying to strip. Now the incoming governor is saying he may well sue.
Yeah. And we may as well, because we believe there are a lot of violations, even equal protection violations here, maybe violations of the Voting Rights Act, violation of open meeting laws. Now, first of all, you have to know who Dallas Woodhouse is. And I don't normally comment too much about him because he has so little credibility. His own brother has called him a racist. He's the executive director that sent out a memo after we won our voter suppression case in the courts. And the courts unanimously said that the Republican Party, the extremists, had engaged in surgical racism. He sent a memo out to the local boards of election, telling them to put in place rules that reflected Republican values and not what the courts had said. So over and over again, this man has, just has no integrity when it comes to telling the truth. So first of all, they did not win the legislature because they won. The current makeup of our legislature is the result of the worst redistricting we've seen since the 19th century. And that's why the courts have said this legislature must have a new election next year. It's normally every 2 years. The lines must be redrawn and they must have a new election because the people elected now the General Assembly is unconstitutionally constituted. That's number one. Number two, the powers that, when he says use the ballroom, that is not the role of the governor. The governor ran an at-large election and was elected. And what they're trying to do now, for instance, they want to change the governor's ability to have his own cabinet. They want it to come through the Senate because they do not want the governor to put in place persons that will help him implement Medicaid expansion or fight for, and more money for public education, and stop sending money to private schools. They do not want that. They do not want this governor to really be able to push the issues of living wages and voting rights. So they want to limit his ability, make him have to go through the Senate in order to get his approval. Number two, while we blocked them from changing the Supreme Court, they now want to force the cases to have to go from Superior Court to a 15-judge appellate panel. They want all the appellate judges to hear it rather than a panel before it goes to the Supreme Court, because now the Supreme Court is a more progressive court. Number three, they're trying to block his appointments on the State Board of Election, because we have somebody now who's elected state public superintendent who is actually really anti-public schools. And they're trying to block his ability to appoint people to the UNC Board of Trustees. And we're still reading some more of the bills that they are pushing through. I mean, everything hasn't even been read. But this is really their fear. I want the listeners to hear this, Amy. They are afraid. They are fearful. They know, for instance, that 58% of North Carolinians want Medicaid expansion. Almost 80% of North Carolinians want a living wage, and this legislature would not even put it on the ballot so that North Carolinians could vote on that. They know that we have beat them in voter suppression. We beat them over voter redistricting, and they see this tide rising. They see, if you look at the pictures yesterday, black and white and Latino people standing together in the Deep South, and they know that if we have policy movement along with this kind of moral movement, it will not only energize North Carolina, but it could energize the rest of the South and cause people to stand up and see that we are no longer in the minority if we engage in real fusion politics. This is Herod in this Christmas season, Aim. I like to say this is Herod politics, the politics of Herod. Herod, if you remember in the Christian story, was so scared of his power, so scared it was going to be taken, that he engaged in the most mean-spirited and vicious kind of attempts to hold on to power. We have a Herod legislature rather than a legislature that is acting like the democracy that we live in.
Well, Reverend Barber, specifically what you mentioned about the necessity now for a new election to the legislature, this almost seems like a last stand of the existing gerrymandered legislature before the new elections come next year. Could you talk about the impact of the Supreme Court decision taking away voting rights protections from many localities around the country, how that might affect the final decision on these these redrawn districts?
Well, I actually think a lot of what we're seeing are last stands. I think when President Obama was elected, for instance, and you had this fusion coalition, remember he won in Virginia, won in North Carolina early on, Florida. I think that scared extremists, which is why you had the 15 who got together and said, we're going to block him from doing anything. You know, Jeff Sessions was in that group who's now being proposed for the Attorney General. I think that the fact that Ryan and McConnell, we talk a lot about the racism of Trump, but look at the racism of McConnell and Ryan. Because for me, racism is not the KKK or David Dukes or calling somebody the N-word. It's policy. It's systemic racism. So, for instance, Ryan and McConnell Boehner have held up fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 1,000 days, almost over 1,200 days since June 25th, 2013, when the Supreme Court passed this ill-fated decision in Shelby. Strom Thurmond only filibustered the Civil Rights Act of '57 for a day, 24 hours. These people have held up fixing Voting Rights Act Section 4 so that Section 5 can be implemented in states like North Carolina for over 1,200 days. They are afraid. They are afraid of this possibility of us organizing all of America. And I think that that's the same thing you see here. This legislature now has been told twice by the highest courts, you are racist. You have engaged in racist voter suppression and racist gerrymandering. They know they cannot win without this. For instance, what they did when they redistricted, they put 49% of black voters into 19 out of 50 Senate districts, and they put 51% of black voters into 27 out of 120 House seats. They did that to isolate, stack, and pack the black vote, not just to disallow or keep black people from being elected, but to keep black and white people from forming fusion coalitions to elect progressive candidates. That's what the game was. And all of that is falling apart now, every bit of it. And they see it falling apart in their face. And we have to understand what is at stake here. And none of it, lastly, would have been possible if we had Section 5 pre-clearance. If Section 5 pre-clearance was in place, and the people in the Congress understand this, none of these laws that have been passed in the South would have been able to have been passed. And if without them, and I think the story, Amy and others, that we have not talked about, is we talk about this election. Ari Berman says we've had almost 900 less voting sites in the black community in this election than we had in 2012. It could have impacted more than 1 million African-American voters. And we did not have one discussion in our national debates, candidates for president, about voting rights and racism as it relates to voting rights. That was a tremendous error during this campaign.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about news from your neighboring state, South Carolina. On Thursday, jurors in Charleston found white supremacist Dylan Storm Roof guilty of 33 counts of federal hate crimes for shooting 9 people dead at the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Church on June 17, 2015. Roof embraced white supremacist views, was shown in photographs posing with the Confederate flag and pistol, now facing the death penalty. Can you talk about Dylan Roof, as well as the rise of white supremacy that we're seeing in the so-called alt-right, and your thoughts on him getting the death penalty, Reverend Barber?
Well, you know, it's a complex conversation. Now, let me give a shout out to my good friend, Dr. Lanny Randolph, who's the president of the South Carolina NAACP, who's been fighting issues in South Carolina for a long time, and the people down there. You know, this is a very Shakespearean moment. You know, he was guilty. We know he was guilty. He confessed to being guilty, and now he's been found guilty, and that is certainly a certain relief for the families. But then the irony of it is we've come through this campaign, this Trumpism, with all of this overt racism and othering. You know, this at the same time we're convicting Dylan Roof. We have a candidate, you know, who is now president-elect, who began his movement on birtherism and demeaning and denouncing the very birthright of our president. We have policies being proposed. We've got Jeff Sessions, who attempted to prosecute civil rights leaders for participating in registering people to vote, who is against voting rights and civil rights, who now will be possibly the Attorney General. We have alt-right, or I call it alt-wrong, and Steve Bannon and white supremacists in the heart of the Oval Office. We haven't seen that, at least that blatantly, since 1915, when Birth of a Nation was played in the Oval Office by Woodrow Wilson. And by the way, Dylan Roof was captured in Shelby, which is the hometown of the playwright who wrote the movie and the script for Birth of a Nation. And now we have this alt-wrong in the Oval Office 100 years later, exact almost to the date. We've gone from Birth of a Nation to in the Oval Office to alt-right in the Oval Office. We have a rise in white supremacy, but we also have a rise in systemic policy. We have people being put in place that are going to do what I call destruction from the inside. Price over HHS, Health and Human Services, who I believe will do great damage to the Health and Human Services, which will hurt many black people and many white people. And we've come through this election where people have been divided by race and fear. You know, Donald Trump is not the first white man who has used racial division to be elected. This is not the first time America has dealt with a racist president. But what we should be surprised about is the ease at which he was able to use it in the 21st century, and the way in which people bought the con and bought this racism and othering that we have seen now. So we're in a troubling time. And while Dalen Roof has been found guilty, lastly, Eamon, South Carolina is still guilty. South Carolina, after those 9 deaths, you know, my frat brother, Reverend Pickney, was killed. He fought for more money for public education. The South Carolina legislature has not passed more money for public education in his name. He fought against voter suppression. Nikki Haley supported voter suppression, and now she's going to be an ambassador to the nations. He fought for the pulling down of the Confederate flag. The flag did not come down until 9 people were killed, which in an eerie way sends the signal that only black death matters. You know, he fought for a living wage. He fought for health care expansion that would help black and poor white people in South Carolina. South Carolina is still guilty of not expanding health care and not raising their living wage and still having right-to-work laws, which are actually right to discriminate laws that keep labor unions out of the South. So, yes, we have convicted Dalen Roof, but South Carolina and America we're still guilty of systemic policy racism. And the only way we're going to get at it is to have a massive fusion moral movement in this country, particularly out in the South. And Amy, on December 31st, we're having a national watch night, moral revival, poor people's campaign watch night service at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., calling people to stand up against extremism, calling for a race class audit that we will release on April the 4th, the anniversary of Dr. King's death, and calling for, lastly, not a remembrance, but a re-engagement of the Poor People's Campaign in 2017, 2018, all across the nation.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, we thank you very much for being with us. President of North Carolina NAACP, Moral Monday's leader. Recent article in Think Progress, we are witnessing the birth pangs of a third Reconstruction. We'll link to it at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, Andrew Bacevich joins us to talk about the generals in the cabinet. Stay with us. Rise by Public Image Limited. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to look at Donald Trump and his military generals.
I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me.
That was Donald Trump on the campaign trail. It was just one of several times where he publicly criticized the actions of U.S. generals. But now that he's become president-elect, Trump has taken a different tack by picking generals for several key posts. Trump has nominated retired General James Mad Dog Mattis as defense secretary. The Obama administration cut short his tour over concerns Mattis was too hawkish on Iran. Retired Marine General John Kelly has been nominated Homeland Security Secretary, and retired Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn has been appointed National Security Advisor. Flynn is well known for his anti-Muslim worldview, having called Islam a cancer and saying, quote, fear of Muslims is rational.
Well, for more, we're joined by Andrew Bacevich, a retired colonel, Vietnam War veteran. His latest book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. He's Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University and joins us in our studio here in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Your thoughts. This is the highest concentration of generals proposed for a cabinet. Is it ever?
Well, I mean, there certainly are precedents for retired generals serving in senior positions. I suppose the most notable of them, the one we remember most, would be George C. Marshall, who, after World War II, was Harry Truman's Secretary of State, and then also served a brief period of time as Secretary of Defense. Well, why did Marshall get those appointments? Because Marshall played a very substantial role in winning World War II. He was a general who won a war. And it seems to me that the common characteristic of the senior generals being appointed by Mr. Trump, and we could add to the list, by the way, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who was just announced to be the chief of staff to Lieutenant General Flynn. So there's at least 4 now generals. The common characteristic is that none of them have won a war. I mean, the country, we are in a state of permanent war, and we certainly have a large cadre of generals with enormous experience in managing wars. We have yet to find a general who can actually bring one of these wars to a successful conclusion. So you have to ask yourself, you know, well, what then are the particular aptitudes or qualities that these people are going to bring to their offices that we could not have found in among the civilian world? And the answer is, I don't know. I mean, the clip you played about Trump expressing contempt for generals, suddenly we have a romance, an infatuation with generals, and perhaps that's simply one more indication of the consistency of Trump being inconsistent.
Doesn't he often get offensive about his things he's defensive about? Like, didn't he get something like 5 deferments?
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, so we have a commander-in-chief, or a commander-in-chief-to-be, who now has suddenly discovered that his affinity for generals, he himself, Trump himself, his military experience was limited to his time as a teenager at New York Military Academy, and he, obviously not he alone, but when he had an opportunity to serve in the military back during the Vietnam era, he chose to find a different route that would make it unnecessary for him to do so.
I want to ask you about the appointment that's gotten perhaps the most concern or controversy is Lieutenant General Mike Flynn for the National Security Advisor. Your thoughts on him?
I mean, he's an Islamophobe. He's an ideologue. He's a fanatic. Temperamentally, and this actually may be the most troubling thing, temperamentally, he does seem to be like Trump himself. You know, I suppose you could say he speaks with great candor, or you could say that he speaks without thinking about the implications of what he has to say. So I think it's a deeply troubling appointment. One could contrast him with Mattis. Mattis, certainly highly respected throughout the military establishment, as far as I can tell, and I suspect was a very, very good Marine general. Why we need a Marine general running the Pentagon is another question. But one might entertain some amount of hope that Mattis will serve as something of a check with regard to Flynn's more radical inclinations, particularly, for example, on issues like Iran. Mattis has said that he believes that we should retain the Iran nuclear deal, and I personally would hope that that counsel prevails.
On the issue of Mike Flynn, he was fired by Obama as head of the DIA. In 2010, he shared classified information in Afghanistan without authorization, but was not brought up on any charges around that. His son recently was involved with the fake news scandal, putting out, his son, Mike Flynn, was his chief of staff of transition, putting out information this pizzeria was the site of a child sex ring in Washington, D.C., and so a man went in with a gun to deal with this fake news. He was fired. Your thoughts further on Mike Flynn and what he means to head up national security?
Well, my sense is that the way presidential politics works, I mean, the politics of the inner circle, is that when a new president takes office, that taking office initiates a competition. It initiates a competition among his senior appointees to determine who's really going to have the ear of the president. For example, if we take the George W. Bush time, we had Cheney as vice president, Colin Powell as Secretary of State, another general, and Donald Rumsfeld. And it rather quickly, particularly after 9/11, became clear that Cheney and Rumsfeld forged an alliance and basically squeezed Colin Powell out. One of the results, of course, I think, is the Iraq War. And so it very much remains to be seen, I think, in the new administration as to how much clout and influence a guy like Flynn is really going to be able to exercise, because we're going to have a Secretary of State, we're going to have a Defense Secretary who may well see things differently. And the three of them, as the big three in national security terms, will compete with one another to see who can then exercise influence over Donald Trump. Of course, with Trump, we have the additional question, and that is, can anybody really influence him? To what degree is he a person who will be amenable to taking counsel of advisors? We were pretty sure previous presidents were willing to do that. We can't be certain about this president.
I want to ask you, you wrote an article recently in The Nation, headline, Barack Obama's Crash Course in Foreign Policy. Your thoughts about how Obama used military force around the world and how a Trump presidency might approach the use of military force differently?
Well, I mean, the gist of the article really is to say that with regard to the use of force, President Obama has been quite ineffective. I mean, he inherited two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. He will bequeath two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Indeed, the expanse of U.S. military involvement has increased over his 8 years in office. But that said, I think when we look beyond his management of wars at other issues, for example, the Paris climate change accords, the Iran nuclear deal, the opening to Cuba, in a variety of other ways, I think President Obama doesn't get the credit that he deserves. And I speculate that over time he may rate higher. You know, it's just so difficult to speculate on Trump. I just learned coming in this morning that his appointee to be the ambassador to Israel is, to put it mildly, a hardliner, is a provocateur.
Well, let's actually talk about David Friedman, the far right-wing bankruptcy lawyer tapped by Donald Trump, as you said, to be U.S. ambassador to Israel. He supports Israel's Jewish-only settlements in the occupied West Bank, says he doesn't think it would be illegal for Israel to annex the entire Palestinian territory, despite the fact, of course, it would be illegal under international law. In October, Friedman appeared on the Israel network I-24 News.
Will Donald Trump recognize Jerusalem as Israel's sole capital?
Yes, he said that countless times, that he will recognize the city of Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital, and he'll move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
All right, so Trump's policies as far as the Israeli Jewish American voter, why should Israeli American voters vote for Trump?
Well, if those who want to see a strong relationship between Israel and the United States with no daylight, those who want to see Israel protected at the United Nations, those who want to see the strongest level of military and strategic cooperation between the two countries, those who don't want to see any daylight between the two countries, those that want to live in an environment where the United States doesn't attempt to impose upon Israel a solution to the Palestinian conflict against the state of Israel, those that want to see Jerusalem recognized as the capital of Israel, vote for Donald Trump.
So that is David Friedman, who Donald Trump has just tapped to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He's actually Donald Trump's bankruptcy lawyer. Your comments on what he just put forward?
Well, ambassadors don't make policy, but, I mean, ambassadors reflect the policies made by the chief of state. But if Friedman knows what he's talking about, then we're about to see a radical change in U.S. policy with regard not simply to Israel, but with regard to the whole Israeli-Palestinian question. And I guess if you are, if I could use a slightly provocative term, an Israel firster, then you might welcome those developments. If you believe, as I believe, that one of the pressing problems we face is trying to restore some semblance of stability to that part of the world, then the steps that he just laid out are going to put us in exactly the other direction. It may work to the benefit of Israel in the short term, but it is simply going to increase the likelihood of violence. It's going to extend the conflicts that have engulfed this part of the world. And from an American perspective, I don't see how that could possibly be viewed as good news.
Well, Andrew Bacevich, we want to thank you for being with us. Retired colonel, Vietnam War vet. His latest book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at Puerto Rico. Stay with us.
I can't seem to face up to the facts. I'm tense and nervous and I can't relax. I can't sleep 'cause my bed's on fire. Don't touch me, I'm a real live wire. Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Fa 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 fa. Better run, 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 run away. Oh, psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Fa 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 fa. Better run, 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 run away. Oh, you start a conversation, you can't even finish.
Psycho Killer, Talking Heads, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Pirates of the Caribbean. That's the name of a shocking new report on how the Bank Santander's revolving door with Puerto Rico's development bank exacerbated a fiscal catastrophe for the Puerto Rican people. Released by Hedge Clippers, the report reveals how two top appointees to the federal overseeing board the federal board, PROMESA, which is overseeing Puerto Rico's financial restructuring, actually helped create the Puerto Rico debt crisis they are now in charge of fixing. The two appointees are former Santander Bank executives José Ramón González and Carlos M. Garcia.
For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Teresa Casartano, the Global Campaigns Organizing Coordinator with Communication Workers of America, or CWA. She's also one of the managers of the Santander Bank Organizing Campaign. Talk about this report, Pirates of the Caribbean.
Hi, good morning. Pirates of the Caribbean, the pirates in this story effectively are the Santander executives that Juan mentioned, José Ramón González and Carlos Garcia. Banco Santander is a global banking giant. It's a Spanish bank. It's headquartered in Madrid. And our report looks at the role of Santander in generating Puerto Rico's public debt. And then when it became unsustainable and Puerto Rico was not able to pay, the very same executives who were responsible for helping to generate that debt were then appointed to the PROMESA Fiscal Control Board to determine how that debt would be restructured and what entities would be paid. And so our report looked at 90 debt deals where Santander was either the principal underwriter or one of a team of underwriters, which resulted in $61.2 billion of public debt for Puerto Rico. And that is almost equivalent to Puerto Rico's current debt load, which is $70 billion. And as an underwriter is essentially an arranger. Santander structured the bonds, purchased the bonds from Puerto Rico, and then sold them to investors. And in return for facilitating these transactions, they were compensated handsomely. They created $61.2 billion in debt and received issuance fees of about $1 billion. In 2009, Carlos Garcia, who was one of the architects of the debt deals, by Santander Securities, he moved from Santander to become the head of the Government Development Bank of Puerto Rico. And so he moved from profiting off the creation of the debt deals to becoming the protector, the gatekeeper, the advisor to the Puerto Rican government and to the government entities that needed to structure new bond deals, and effectively became the approver and the selector of the underwriters who would facilitate these deals. And so what some people have called him inside hedge clippers is the fox then guarding the hen house. And as the president of the Government Development Bank, Carlos Garcia brought in a team of current and former Santander executives who really had a grip on the development bank, on the Government Development Bank from 2009 until 2012. And under his leadership, the Government Development Bank used a number of what some people call questionable, others call abusive or predatory debt structures. And one example that we could use is a debt structure called the COFINA bond. And the COFINA bond was often used to refinance unpaid interest on previous bonds. And the COFINA bond was backed by sales tax. And so effectively, these bonds were backed by the taxes, on the sales tax on small transactions by poor people and working people of Puerto Rico. And each time that those bonds were issued, Santander...
Teresa, I just wanted to clarify. Gonzalez and Garcia had both worked with Santander at one time or another. They then went over to the government side to actually be involved in the issuing of these. And now both of them, of many of these bonds, and now both of them are in charge of figuring out how to get Puerto Rico out of the mess that they helped create. But the amazing thing is that one of them was appointed by the Democrats and the other was appointed by the Republicans. So it doesn't seem that both the Republicans in Congress and the Obama administration have no problem with the people who created the crisis now trying to figure out how to solve it.
That's exactly right. José Ramón González and Carlos Garcia at different times were the head of the Government Development Bank and also top executives, at other times top executives of Santander Securities responsible for issuing the bonds. And so, yes, that is exactly correct. When the debt became unsustainable in 2014...
We only have about 15 seconds to go. Go ahead.
In 2014 and 2015, and the Fiscal Control Board was appointed by the Obama administration. Of the 7 political appointees, those 2 executives were appointed to the Fiscal Control Board to determine what entities will be paid under the debt restructuring.
We want to thank you very much for being with us. Teresa Casartano, the Global Campaigns Organizing Coordinator with CWA. This is Democracy Now! Happy birthday to Renee Feltz. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for another edition of Democracy Now!